Hello everyone, welcome back. I hope you're doing well. The Premier League have announced their 2023-24 Manager of the Season nominees, and that got me thinking, well, what about everyone else? So, today we are going to be fixing that. Today we are going to be ranking every single Premier League manager from this season, and we're going to be doing it with a twist. As you can see, this is not a normal ranking table. This is an alignment chart, and what it does is it uses two different things. It uses an x-axis to measure one value, and it uses a y-axis to measure another. Now what we're going to be doing with this is, along the x-axis, we are going to be putting the actual performance of every manager. Along the y-axis, going from top to bottom, we are going to be putting their expectation. And we're going to be plotting managers on this alignment chart with the hopes of eventually getting to some kind of visual representation from the Premier League season this year. This sounds very complicated, but I promise you it's not. What we're doing is essentially categorizing every manager into one of these four categories. You have bad season, high expectations. You have bad season, low expectations. Good season, low expectations, and good season, high expectations. Now, naturally, if you have a good season but you had lower expectations, that's obviously better than a good season with higher expectations. And the same works the other way. If you have a bad season but you had low expectations, well, that's not actually too bad. If you had a bad season with good expectations, then you're pretty poor. And we're going to be ranking these managers along every single category. And depending on how close to the corner they are, that's how strong their position is in that category. It'll all make sense once we dive into it. So, let's begin. The first one we're going to start with is Roy Hodgson. Now, Roy obviously got sacked. He left his position at Crystal Palace, and we need to weigh up their expectation. And their expectation, I think, was to be pretty fine in the Premier League, and they eventually got dragged somewhat into a relegation battle. Things got a little bit uncertain. The fans weren't particularly happy with the style of play, and it needed to be changed. So, for that reason, I think Roy himself had a pretty bad season. The expectation wasn't particularly too good, but again, he wasn't really expected to do anything too crazy. So I think that's fine. Let's now talk about his counterpart, Oliver Glasner, who has come in and done a pretty good job at Crystal Palace, it's got to be said. I don't think we can really make a judgment on him after only 10 plus games. However, he's already come in and started to do quite well. And I don't actually think there was a particularly high expectation from Oliver Glasner. I don't think people really knew what to expect from him. So the fact that he's had a pretty good start to his life at Crystal Palace just means that really he's done okay. So that's where we've put him. We've put him with low expectations, and he's had a pretty decent start. See where I'm going with this? Moving over towards the actual relegation candidates, and I think that Paul Heckingbottom and Chris Wilder are in pretty much the same boat. They've both taken over Sheffield United, who really didn't have any expectations of staying in the Premier League, considering how high their quality of their squad was, and considering how much really went against them in terms of injuries. That's not necessarily the manager's fault, but I think you can fairly say that the manager had a pretty poor season. He obviously got sacked. Now, Chris Wilder is a little bit more interesting, because can you really argue that he did a better job than Paul Heckingbottom? And I'm not really sure that you can. So for that reason, I think they're both going to be stuck in and around there. Not on very high expectations, but a pretty terrible season. Let's move it on. And I think that Steve Cooper and Nottingham Forest had pretty standard expectations to stay in the Premier League. I don't think they imagined they would be really dragged into a massive relegation battle. And for that reason, I think that generally he's more in the higher expectation camp, I think. And obviously, he's had a pretty terrible campaign. Obviously, he hasn't done very well. Nottingham Forest felt like they needed to let him go, and they brought in Nuno Espirito Santo, who is doing okay, but still not really fulfilling the role. I mean, the question remains to be asked whether Nuno is going to get them out of trouble, but if he doesn't, does he go right by Steve Cooper? He's probably doing a little bit better than Cooper at the minute, but they're still in a relegation battle. They're still failing to majorly convert chances, and I'm sorry, no matter what anybody tells me, it's not only down to the referees. I think if anybody would have said to you, or any Luton fan for that matter, that Luton would be within 2 games of staying in the Premier League, they would have bitten your hand off. That is how low the expectation was for Luton to do anything in the Premier League. And I've got to say that although they're in a relegation battle, considering what's happened, I actually think that they've done a pretty sensational job. I think Rob Edwards has actually managed to really pull something out the bag. The Luton squad is clearly nowhere near the quality level of the rest of the squads, and yet they're playing above and beyond, and they've given themselves a shot, and that is down to the coaching quality of Rob Edwards. Correct me if I'm wrong, Burnley fans, but I think there was an air of optimism around Vincent Kompany and what he could do with this Burnley squad, and there might have been an air of expectation of staying up. Perhaps that's mixed in with belief, but I do think that Vincent Kompany was expected to do a little bit better than he actually has done. And considering that Burnley are very, very close to relegation, I'm not so sure he's done a better job than Nuno Espirito Santo or Steve Cooper. I'm not too sure. And for that reason, I just think that perhaps I'm being a little bit harsh on Burnley, but the expectation around Vincent Kompany, the way he played, and the fact that he was linked with the Tottenham job just gives me the thought and the inkling that he might not have performed in the way that he was expected to. Let's go a bit higher up the table now and talk about Marco Silva. Considering that the fact that they lost Mitrovic and they're pretty comfortably mid-table, I actually think that he's done a pretty alright job, and considering the fact that they lost Mitrovic, along with some real concerns over the squad, I think Marco Silva's actually done a pretty decent job at Fulham. They haven't run towards relegation at all. They haven't made too many complaints about themselves, and they've got the odd scalp here or there, and actually their home form is really impressive. So for me, I think he's done a pretty decent job with fairly reasonably low expectations. This next one is a little bit difficult. Thomas Frank and Brentford. Now, when you're thinking about Brentford and considering their last season, I think it's pretty easy to fall into the category of, well, you should be doing better, when really, when you think about the size of Brentford, what they're actually doing and how hard they're punching above their weight, I still think the expectation for what they were meant to achieve this season was pretty low. Probably not as low as I've put it, but when you consider it, I think they've actually underperformed somewhat. I don't think it's a particularly terrible season, I don't think it's a particularly bad season, but just really without Ivan Toney, the injuries have obviously played a massive part, but that has obviously taken a toll onto the way that Thomas Frank has been able to manage this Brentford side. And regardless of how you look at it, they were in a relegation battle up until around game week 34, 35. Perhaps it was a little bit earlier than that, but you understand my point. I think that when they look back on this season, they'll be fairly disappointed. Of course, they're still in the Premier League, and that is a major, major plus. We'll see what happens with Ivan Toney in the summer. They've navigated it quite well, and as I'm saying that, perhaps Thomas Frank's done a bit of a better job than I've given him credit for. But I still do think that they're a bit lower than they would want to be themselves, and that's why he's there. Let's talk about someone with high expectations, and I think the expectations couldn't really have been higher for Erik ten Hag following such a good season previously with Manchester United, finishing within the top 4, those Champions League spaces, and then obviously winning a trophy. Now, don't get me wrong, the FA Cup final is something that you really need to take into consideration, but I don't really think that it could have gone much worse for Manchester United. I really don't. I don't see where the positives come from. Erik ten Hag's brand of football is still yet to be properly identified. It's still yet to really have a foothold in the Premier League. And then when you consider the fact that he really was expected to take this club on, take them forwards a little bit more, and you look at their statistics, they've got the highest amount of losses that they've ever had in a Premier League season. I think they're on track to concede the most amount of goals that they've ever done in a Premier League season. It can't really get much worse, and considering the expectation and the values that they had going into the season, it's a massive, massive disappointment. Sean Dyche's objective from the beginning of the season would have obviously been to keep Everton out of the relegation zone, and while he has done that, I do think that he was fairly expected to. I think the expectations for him were to keep them there, to be honest. And then when you look at the points deductions, when you look at the fact that they really should be a lot higher, I actually think you need to give Sean Dyche quite a lot of credit. Given the points deductions, or take those point deductions away, they're actually sitting pretty comfortably mid-table, around 13th position, 12th position. And really, that's exactly where Everton would prefer to be in this current point in time. Obviously, they managed to avoid relegation, and I think that's mainly down to the managerial nous of Sean Dyche. Unai. I think the remit for Unai Emery at Aston Villa would have been European places, top 10. Make sure you just get us creeping that little bit higher. To be nearly comfortably in the Champions League places is nothing short of brilliance. And considering the fact that they didn't expect to be anywhere near Champions League football, they might want it, but I don't think they expected it. I think Unai Emery has done an unbelievable job. And let's not forget, at the current point of recording, they are still in Europe. They are down in the tie, but they are still in Europe, and hopefully for Villa fans, they get over the line and manage to turn that around. But regardless of whether they get knocked out or not, it's been a fantastic season for Aston Villa, a team who might be playing Champions League football next year, and that is thanks to Unai Emery. This one's going to be divisive. Eddie Howe. Now, before Newcastle fans start asking me or telling me, I understand about the injuries. I get it. It's huge. Big. I do get it. However, the expectations for Newcastle, I think, from last season would have been to reclaim another place in the Champions League. I think that would have been the ideal situation, and I think they would have backed Eddie Howe to try and really make a good go of it. Now, don't get me wrong, the injuries have played a massive part, and I don't necessarily think they've underperformed. I just think they've middled out a little bit. I think the hype around Newcastle and the squad was very much really overblown. I do think they have a great starting 11, but going down through the squad and considering the injuries, I actually think that Eddie Howe has done a pretty good job. I think the expectation was pretty high for him to finish in and around those European places, and he's kind of there. And really, when you consider the fact that he's had to deal with so many injuries and the fact that they're still really fighting for 5th, 6th position, Europa League isn't too bad, but is it where they would want to be? Maybe not. So for that reason, I think he's there. I think so. It's a tough one. It really is. But the injuries, without the injuries, would they been comfortably in the Champions League? I'm not so sure. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. He's getting a lot of stick at the minute, but I think that Ange Postecoglou has done a pretty good job at Tottenham Hotspur. I don't think the expectations would have been too high, and although he might miss out on Champions League football, I think Tottenham have had a pretty good season. He's reinvented the style of play, and while it seems a little bit naive or stubborn, he's still managed to bring back a feeling of greatness to Tottenham, a feeling of enjoyment, and that is something that needs to be said for a fan base that have had to sit through Antonio Conte and Jose Mourinho. Really, he's brought them back to where I think they would want to be, challenging for those European places, and he's done it doing a pretty good style. Injuries have massively hit him. When you think about the fact that they've lost Maddison, they've lost Udogie at certain points, they've lost Basuma at certain points, it's huge. It's really, really big. And the fact that he's managed to deal with all that, I think, puts him pretty comfortably in a decent season category. Now, if we're going to be talking divisive, this one's going to be fun. Pep Guardiola. Now, there's no doubt that Pep Guardiola has had a fantastic season. I don't think you can challenge for the Premier League going into the last 2 games and not have had a great season. However, I think he's expected to win it. He's absolutely expected to win it. He's got to win it. Look at the squad that they've got. Look at the ability that they've got. Look at how well coached they are. He's got to win it. He has to. It's a failure if Manchester City do not win the Premier League. And for that matter of fact, and for that reason alone, he's expected to win it. So, although he's had a really good season, he's expected to. And I don't think he can be compared to the season that Unai Emery has at the moment. Roberto De Zerbi, Brighton. They play lovely football, but they've been decimated by injuries, and almost to a certain extent, I think De Zerbi's almost at fault for his own success from last season, playing a beautiful brand of football, but at times being a little bit stubborn in the way that they want to play out, clearly being exploited on certain occasions due to some of their patterns of play. That being said, they sit in 11th, I believe, at this current point in time, and I don't actually think that's that bad, but I also don't think it's that great considering where they were previously. But we do need to remember, it's Brighton. And for all of the De Zerbi in, De Zerbi out shenanigans going on, I think he's done a pretty good job with the squad that he's got, playing some nice football. I wouldn't go to say it's been a great season because, like I said, they're going to finish comfortably mid-table. But the expectation would have just been to do more again, do more of the same again. I don't think there was a pretty high expectation of him this season. Perhaps it was a little bit higher, but nothing too crazy. And he's still done all right considering the injuries. Brighton are okay, and I think for the most part, De Zerbi is as well. David Moyes, off of the high of last season, I'm struggling to wonder where the expectation would have been from him. Obviously it would have been higher than where they finished previously, which was extremely low, but they won a European trophy, so that covered up the real problem they had in the league. They now sit comfortably mid-table, and I think that's actually a pretty decent job. But was he expected to do better? Was he expected to finish quite high? And I'm not necessarily sure he was. The response from the West Ham fans and I think the expectation of the board are two completely different things, and that's probably context for another video. If you'd like to see something like that, let me know in the comments below. But I really do think that David Moyes has done okay. I mean, maybe he's just there. Maybe. He's done okay. He's alright. He's obviously going to be leaving at the end of the season, and I think that's probably where West Ham are at. The fans want to see a better brand of football, and the board probably want their own guy. Someone who they believe can take West Ham on a little bit further, but there's nothing wrong with the stability that David Moyes gives a side. I'm struggling in this kind of area, so for the lack of a better response, I'm going to put him here. I think he's had an okay season. They've finished comfortably mid-table. They've had a frenzy in Europe. They've gotten beaten by arguably the best European side at the minute in Bayer Leverkusen. So I think they've done alright. When Bournemouth sacked Gary O'Neill and brought in Andoni Iraola, I think a lot of people were murmuring. A lot of people were very confused. A lot of people didn't have too many expectations for Bournemouth, but they've done really, really well. I think they're punching massively above their weight in terms of quality, and I think that's credit to how well Andoni Iraola has coached the squad. They play a very exciting, very high-intense brand of football. Dominic Solanke is a player reborn, and really, I think he's just done a fantastic job with pretty low expectations. So the expectations would have been, keep us in the Premier League, make sure that we're okay. And they are. And they're kicking on to bigger and better things next season, I'm sure. This one's going to be fun. Jurgen Klopp. Now, before any Liverpool fans start talking to me, I don't think Jurgen Klopp's expectation for this season was to win the league. I really don't. I think, considering the season they had last year, top 4 was a minimum, yes, but I don't think there was anywhere near the expectation to win the league. So considering the fact that he's managed to get his objective, he's claimed Champions League football, they had a flurry in the Premier League to go for the title. They've fallen short, of course, but the expectation was not there. I think he's massively overperformed with the squad that they currently have, and he's taken Liverpool on yet another journey. It's unfortunately a journey that has led them to sadness, but it's sometimes the ride rather than the destination, and that sounds ridiculous, but I think it will be something that he's remembered for, taking Liverpool and their fans and their players on a journey. And in his final season at the club, that's exactly what he's done. He's had a pretty good season in my book. Let me paint a picture for you. You are Gary O'Neill. You've just been sacked by Bournemouth. It's your first major managerial position. You've been picked up by Wolverhampton Wanderers. You have sold Ruben Neves, and you've sold Mateus Nunes, two of your star players. My question to you is, are you expected to finish mid-table? No, you're not. No. And for that reason, I think that Gary O'Neill has done a remarkable job of finishing where he has, or generally where they are. I think a load of people had Wolves contending for the drop. I think Wolves fans had Wolves contending for the drop. Some of them, at the very least. And when you think about the job that he's done, the way that he's got the side playing, the defensive solidity, Hwang is scoring goals. Mateus Cunha is scoring goals. These players have quality, and Gary O'Neill is getting that quality out of them. And so I think he's done a pretty remarkable job. And then there were two. But before we do that, we're going to be doing a little bit of editing on this graph, because I've had a think. And I don't think that Nuno Espirito Santo has probably had the bad campaign that I think I've probably made it seem. Roy Hodgson probably wasn't that bad, considering they weren't really in a relegation place. They weren't playing great, don't get me wrong, but it's not a terrible, terrible season. Vincent Kompany probably is around about here, and I do think that Steve Cooper has failed to really get anything out of this Nottingham Forest side, but still that might be a little bit harsh. I still do think that Erik ten Hag has done a terrible job of trying to impact a style of play, and for that reason he still stays there. And then we need to talk about Unai Emery, because after previous thought, Unai Emery probably wasn't, or probably didn't go into the season with zero expectations. So that might be a little bit incorrect. I think he's had some expectations, but I don't think it's anywhere near what he's managed to do. And when you consider the fact that he's had a sensational season and he's done it above and beyond the expectations that are given, I still think he's around this category. That's a little bit of the changes that we need to make. Perhaps David Moyes has had an okay season. Thomas Frank here, De Zerbi probably here-ish, probably. Anyway, I'm getting off track. Next up, finally, we have Mikel Arteta. Now, he's in a Premier League title race. He's currently 1 point, or generally 1 point around Manchester City, who, if they win all their games, Man City will win the league. But I think that Mikel Arteta's expectations would have been to challenge again. Do I think he would have been expected to challenge in the way that he has done again? Yes, probably. But he still had a sensational season. I do think he's had a better season than Klopp has, naturally. I do think that Emery has had possibly a better season. Well, it's all in relation, isn't it? I don't think you can really say that, yeah, possibly. So in that instance, I think Arteta's done okay. I do think he's expected to challenge again, though, and that's the crux for me. And that's why Emery's a lot higher here than Arteta is, because the expectation is different. I think Arteta is meeting his expectation, whereas I think Unai Emery is surpassing his expectation, if that makes sense. Just some different things. And then there was one, Mauricio Pochettino. Now, considering the squad, considering the amount of work that needs to be done on it, and considering the terrible season they had previously, I think expectations were pretty low. And perhaps the expectations would have been for some kind of European football, which he is kind of on for. Considering the fact that they've had two cup finals, I think he's done okay. I really do. I think he's done okay. I don't think it's anything spectacular. I don't think it's anything crazy, and he's definitely underperforming in the league in comparison to where Chelsea want to be. I understand that. But you need to understand that this needs to take time, and considering the profile of the squad that they have and the age of the group, it's really expected for Chelsea to be a bit wobbly. It's expected for them to be a bit volatile. They're going to be. They're young players. They don't have the consistency in them to play continuously week in, week out. They just don't. So, considering all of that, I think Pochettino's done okay and probably can be regarded as having a good season this year. Let me know your thoughts on that one, because Pochettino, I think, is going to be a contentious one. And that is it. Those are my manager rankings. Now, I know this wasn't a normal ranking tier list video, but it was something a little bit different that I wanted to try. So please let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. As for interpreting the graph, I think it's really interesting. You've got a nice curve here, which is really interesting to see. You've got the likes of Chris Wilder and Heckenbottom out here as outliers. Same goes for Pep Guardiola here. And then when you're talking about my actual manager rankings, if you ever wanted to look into that, I think you'd interpret the x-axis first, so whoever had the best season, then compare it by going up the y-axis, which is just up here, and then you'd reach Unai Emery. Unai Emery is my manager of the season. Probably followed downwards by Mikel Arteta and Pep Guardiola. I think you've got to put him there because he's challenging for a title. Jurgen Klopp is probably fourth, and then you've got Gary O'Neill, who I think is being massively disrespected for the nominees. I just think he's done a sensational job with Wolves, losing Ruben Neves, losing Mateus Nunes, managing to get something out of Hwang Hee-chan, managing to get something out of Mateus Cunha. I think he's done a brilliant, brilliant job, as have a lot of the managers this season. But my question to you is, who is your manager of the season? And what is your ranking? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. If you don't want to do the 20-1 because that takes a bit of time, then just let me know your highlights. I would love to hear from you, and I love reading the comments, so please do get involved. Thank you ever so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I hope to see you in the next one. And yeah, take care.